Hello and welcome to this lesson for Higher Biology. This is the first lesson in the second unit, which is Metabolism and Survival. And this lesson is looking at metabolic pathways and proteins. So primarily what we're looking at is the need for cell metabolism. And what you need to be able to do is define the term metabolism, explain what is meant by a metabolic pathway, describe and compare anabolic and catabolic pathways, and explain how the cell membrane helps to manage these pathways. So the term metabolism is used often in day-to-day language, but what it's referring to isn't necessarily the same as what we would use to refer to it when we're discussing it biologically. Metabolism is really the totality of all of the reactions happening within any given cell, and therefore within any given organism. Within the cell itself, it's like a little chemical factory where there are thousands of reactions occurring. Some things are using up energy and producing products, and some things are breaking down and producing energy. Some organisms are even able to convert some of that energy that they're taking in into light energy, such as in jellyfish where they can bioluminesce. So the totality of these pathways and reactions is what we call metabolism. So the metabolism of this cell is the entirety of all of the reactions it's doing to take in all of this foodstuffs, breaking it down, releasing energy and heat, and then for that energy to be used back up again to build other molecules. Now we have thousands of metabolic pathways integrated throughout both the cell and the organism. And all this means is that often the products of one pathway are being used as the reactants in another. So most pathways are interlinked with each other, meaning that each one of them is vital to the cell and the organism's survival. In order to control these pathways, we need to primarily use enzymes. And if you remember from National 5, enzymes are all proteins, and you should know from our last unit as well that proteins are produced as a result of specific genes being expressed. So the genetic information contained by an organism allows them to produce these proteins, which are enzymes which help control the pathways. So a control of a pathway might involve specific enzymes breaking down specific molecules and the products of that reaction being used for a further reaction until we can eventually reach our end product, such as here where we've started off with molecule A and we've gone through 3 different reactions catalysed by different enzymes until we've reached our final product here. This is obviously a very short and simple pathway. We may have other potential reactions happening. We may have build-up or breakdown of any one of these molecules, in which case we would be prevented from our pathway from continuing, or we may have to look at an alternative pathway. And we'll cover those later on as we get through the course. There are 2 main types of pathway that we need to consider. We have catabolic and anabolic pathways. Catabolic pathways are types which release energy, as we are breaking down complex molecules into simpler compounds. An anabolic pathway, on the other hand, is one that takes these simple compounds and builds up a more complex molecule, however that uses up some of this energy. So a catabolic pathway can be the breakdown of a complex molecule into simple molecules. For example, when we use up glucose and oxygen in respiration, and that produces energy in the form of ATP and also releases water and carbon dioxide as its byproducts. On the other hand, we have anabolic pathways, which is where we build up a more complex molecule and using energy from ATP. So for example, as we've just looked at previously, we have amino acids being used to combine to make a protein molecule. Now that requires energy to form those peptide bonds between the amino acids, and so we're taking smaller molecules to build up a more complex molecule and using ATP energy in which to do it. Now within the cell, these pathways are taking place pretty much everywhere. Primarily, you've learned that the cytoplasm is the site of all cell reactions, and that's still true. However, it's quite specifically related to various specific areas within the cytoplasm, by which we mean mostly the areas next to the cell membranes. So you'll remember from National 5 that the cell is surrounded by a cell membrane, which is referred to as the fluid mosaic model. We've got our phospholipid bilayer going around, which is embedded with specific enzymes and proteins, and that's what gives us this mosaic reference. Now, it's also important to realise that within the cell we've also got all of the organelles, which you already know about. We've got the nucleus, we've got the mitochondria, we've got ribosomes, etc. Now they are all surrounded by membranes. So we've got the nuclear membrane, we've got the plasma membrane surrounding the outside of the cell, we've got the membrane around the mitochondria, and so on. So each one of these membranes contains very specific proteins embedded within it that allow it to help carry out different reactions. When we have all of these different membranes available to the cell, allows more compartments and gives us more surface area on which all of those reactions can take place. It also allows specific areas of the cell to have higher concentrations of specific molecules, and that allows us to increase the chemical reaction rate. For example, when we look at the mitochondria, we'll have a little look at how respiration takes place in this mitochondria, but how the membranes are specific to those reactions and how they've got the right proteins to help respiration take place. So the cell membrane and the membrane of all of those different organelles, the mitochondria, the ribosome, the nucleus, etc., has this phospholipid bilayer and the specifically embedded proteins within it. And often these proteins, particularly ones like channel proteins and carrier proteins, which are helping molecules move in and out, or ones which are maybe signalling proteins or enzymes, are quite heavily involved in these metabolic pathways. And they're helping manage the movement of molecules in and out of the cell, or in and out specific areas of the cell, in order for these reactions to happen. And by changing the proteins, which are actually embedded within each section of the membrane, allows you to change the different reactions which can happen. And that's what allows specific cells to carry out specific roles, by having these specific proteins embedded within them. So as well as carriers, the proteins in the membrane could be used for signalling, they could be used for anchoring, and they could be used as enzymes. So picking what proteins are present on a particular stretch of membrane tailors the reactions and the response of that specific area of membrane. Now the ones that you guys would be specifically really expected to know would be the ones around enzyme activity, anything that involves transport, and perhaps a little bit of signal transduction as well. So what you're mostly looking at is the fact that we have enzymes present on the membrane, we have transport proteins, some of which are pores, which allow molecules to move straight through, as some which involve active transport, which are pumps which move specific molecules from one side of the membrane into the other. So you should know that metabolism is the totality of reactions involved in a cell, that a metabolic pathway is the use of several reactions to produce one end product, that an anabolic pathway is one which is involved in the building up of complex molecules from simpler ones, and that a catabolic pathway is the opposite, is breaking down complex molecules into simpler ones. And you should be able to explain that the cell membrane helps to manage those pathways by having the correct proteins embedded within it in the area around which those reactions are going to happen. So the reactions that are involved in respiration, for example, are all related to the proteins that are embedded within the membrane of the mitochondria, in order so that the reactions can happen in and around that specific organelle. As ever, if you've got any questions about this, please feel free to ask as we go over it later on in class.